We just looked at the 7 primitive data types in JavaScript. Everything else in JavaScript is an object. Primitive data types contain a single value, where objects are a collection of values or a composite value. That collection may include primitive values or other objects. Objects use key value pairs for storing that collection of data. Let's take a look at that really quick. So I'm going to set up an object here. And here's where I begin entering my key value pairs. Name is a key. Stephen is the value. Address the key. And now the value I'm going to put for address is another object. So I put the curly braces. Inside of that object, I can then have additional key value pairs. Like this. So there I have a simple JavaScript object. Now there are other attributes of objects that I want to mention, and since this is an object, those attributes should apply. So let me save that, and we'll come out here to the console. Just display it. There's my object. If I open it up, I can see the address property inside. This is a key value pair. Many times we refer to them as properties. If the value that the property contains is a function, then we may refer to it as a method. So properties and methods make up an object. And so I can see those properties. Now, something else that is an attribute of objects in JavaScript, which we'll talk about in more detail later, is that they all are associated with a prototype or a prototype chain. And we can see that there. Inside of this prototype chain, we have access to additional properties and methods set up using key value pairs. Now, since this is an object, I should be able to add additional properties to it. So I can do that using .syntax. I'm going to add a state. Since I'm located in Utah, that's the state I will add. Now when we take a look at that object, we now have a new key value pair, a new property for state. And we should be able to retrieve that. So I can retrieve name, or I can retrieve state, or address. We can add and retrieve from objects in JavaScript. And so these are the attributes of objects in JavaScript. Now, if we do a type of this, of course, it's going to return object. But what about some of the other data types that we know of in JavaScript? For example, functions and arrays. These are objects with specific purposes. So they're still objects, but they have additional functionality to them. But they will function as objects. So let's set up a couple of those other types of objects, specialized objects that we have in JavaScript, and just take a look at them. So first, a function. This can be a really simple function. Just log something to the console. That's all we're doing. There we go. We have a function. Let's also set up an array. Just put a few numbers in here. There we have an array. Let's do a date. Let's do a map. You may not be familiar with maps, but basically anything in JavaScript other than those primitives are objects. We're going to take a look at that. So let me save that really quick. We'll just jump back out here and type of date. type of map. Let's do type of array. And now let's do type of function, the function we created. That was test. Notice it returns function. So type of for a function returns function, even though it is an object. It's a specialized object, obviously much more specialized than many of the other objects that we work with, because it contains a property that can be invoked and run as code. And so the type of for a function returns function, but it is an object. And we can prove that it's an object by showing that it has some of the other properties that objects have. For example, I should be able to add a property to this function. So I'm going to do test.date. I'm going to set it equal to new date. Say I wanted a date associated when this function was created. Now I can retrieve that. If I take a look at it without invoking it, without putting the parentheses, I can see the code of that function. But if I do a console.dir, I can see additional properties associated with it. There's the date that we added. We can also see that there's a prototype that has additional properties and methods. So a function is an object. The same thing could be done for the array. Let's say I want to give the array a name. Now we have the property that we added. There was already a length property associated with it. And then an array also is attached to a prototype chain, which contains other methods and properties. So all of these things are objects that we're working with. Now another idea or another feature of JavaScript that supports the idea that objects are everywhere are the built-in objects available in JavaScript. Now we were working with one briefly, and that's date. Date is a built-in object. But on this MDM page, we can see a number of the built-in objects that are available for us to work with. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that there's a built-in object for number. There's a built-in object for string. There's a built-in object for Boolean. Some of these primitive values that we've talked about have built-in objects. Well, what are those for? Well, they are there so that we can work with those primitive values as objects in certain cases. We can work with them as if they were objects. So, for example, when we create a string, there is a string object wrapper that is associated with that string, which allows us to work with it as if it were an object. Let's just look at that really quick. So I'm going to set up a string. Now notice what I can do with string. I can do str.length. That's a property. It tells me how many characters inside of that string. So we're working with that like it is an object using the dot syntax. Now, can we add new properties to it? Let's take a look at that. No, we cannot. So the string object wrapper is there for us to be able to work with the existing data that is in that primitive in different ways. For example, with numbers, we can format the number a bit. With strings, we have a number of different methods for working with a string, such as index of. It finds the location of this particular text string. So there are a number of methods for working with these primitive data types. So basically that reinforces the idea that objects are everywhere. If you're going to work in JavaScript, you need to get used to working with objects, and you need to understand objects because they are everywhere. All right, let's move on.